Hello and welcome to Simon Says Artwork. In this video I'm going to be doing a watercolour painting using this set of Winsor & Newton watercolour paints, and I'm going to be doing it on this paper here. And what I'm going to be doing is painting a farmer who I met at a local farm, and I'm going to frame the painting and take it to him. So okay, let's get started. Okay, so when it comes to doing watercolour, there's several things that you have to keep in mind. And whilst I'm doing this sketching, I'm doing this with a 0.05 fine liner nib. So what I'll do is, whilst I'm doing the sketching stage, I'll talk about my thought process when it comes to doing a watercolour painting. What I learnt was that when you're doing a watercolour painting, to try and find, first of all, I start with the colour of the sky. And that's not always blue, but in this case it was a very, very light blue. So what I do is I water down the blue paint until it's almost invisible, but not quite. You can still see a hint of blue in the mix, but I try to make sure that it's very diluted, because that way everything's going to have a hint of blue. And I don't like the idea of anything being white necessarily, because that's such heightened brightness that it really does change the dynamic of the atmosphere that you're creating. So my concept is, well, not my concept necessarily, but my understanding of the concept is that if you tint everything with the lightest tone of the sky, then that is the light that is shining on everything that you are painting and describing in your picture. So that's what I start with, is the very lightest blue. And the principle carries to every other colour except the fact that the blue is washed over a lot of the painting. I don't know if I do that with this painting, but ordinarily that is how I would approach a watercolour painting, is to do everything with this light blue first. And otherwise, every colour, I find the lightest tone of it in the reference that I'm using, and I mix that, and I probably mix it lighter than what it truly is in the reference. Also, what happens is that watercolour can dry lighter than what it appears to be when it's wet. So that doesn't hurt. To me, that's fine, because watercolour painting is all about layers. You don't want it to look like acrylic paint, so you don't want to really layer it on heavy and thick. You want it to be a lot of light layers that sit on top of each other. This does mean that you have to wait for the paint to dry, because it's a lot of using more water than in pigment, which means that you'll have to sit and wait for it to dry. Otherwise, when you apply the next colour, it will bleed into the previous water mix that you applied. And ideally you don't have that. What you really want to have is colours sitting in their own space under your controlled application. So the way that I approach it is to try to make sure that each layer is dried. I then mix the lightest colour, the lightest mix of the next colour, and then I apply that. Now, regarding the drawing, you can see that I'm not really taking too long to measure, and I'm not doing a lot of working out. I'm just kind of trying to guess it a lot, and with this tyre I go a little bit wrong, but I'm just trying to get a general sense of what the vehicle looks like and get something relatively close. My favourite part at the moment is the little cabin part, the part where the farmer is sat, and that roof and windows. I really like those shapes. I think that's really nice, and I think that's my favourite part of drawing this so far, is the shapes that you find in the tractor. I think are really quite interesting. Now there's a lot of details in this image, so I try to get the most important parts just as I'm drawing there, that symbol which stays white. Now there is writing on this back part here which I don't include, and in hindsight I wish I had, because it wouldn't have taken too long or been too difficult to avoid and retain the whiteness for that colour. So here we go. This is me adding a load of water to one section, then adding a bit of blue, and you can see that even though you can see the blue, I'm now washing it over the entire painting, so I do apply it the way that I thought I would. And you can see on the paper it looks like there's barely any colour at all. So I add blue a little bit more heavy whilst it's in there, which is impatient of me, but I thought because it's so light, I don't know how long it's going to take. Now it's worth having a tissue handy, because there's certain parts that you might want to pull back a little bit, and that's the good thing about watercolour, is that you can always dab it away and it will just disappear. And again, this is not the way that I should have approached this, but on the early stages I started to apply light mixes of the red onto the tractor as well. It's just being a little bit too impatient here really. And you can see what happens is that the red's starting to bleed above the tractor into the blue area, and the blue will be bleeding into the sky. It's not the desired effect, and I knew this before doing it, but it's one of the hardest parts of watercolour painting to me, is being patient enough to let each layer dry. And I highly recommend that you don't do it the way that I just have. You wait for it to dry first. And then again, I start to do this mix of very light colours and applying them to the areas that I think have this rusty brown look to them. And it has it on the insides of the wheels, but it also does have bits on the tyres that will be bits of mud and dirt and things which have tracked onto the tyres. So I do want a sense of that. Now whilst the page is wet, I thought I might as well get down some tones for the earth and the ground. And in an ideal world I would have waited for that so that each layer would have dried. But I'll stop saying that now, because you know that is what I should have done. That's what I'm recommending you do. And it's why I'm having to use the tissue all the time, is to pull back the parts that are bleeding into areas that I don't want them. But there we are. Rule number 1, wait for it to dry. I suppose rule number 1 would be mix your colours incredibly light. And rule number 2 would be apply the first colour and wait for it to dry before you apply the second. If I would have done that, it would have probably been so much easier to keep the colours where I wanted them, instead of having to dab it with a tissue like this. But there we are. The point being is that once it dries, it becomes this different consideration where you can now work on each section with a lot more control. But each colour, so long as you mix it incredibly light like I have done here, and you can see all of these colours are so watery that there's hardly any tonal values yet. And this is the darkest thing that I've mixed, and it's the sheds which are in shadow in the background. And it's still a very light mix of what the sheds will become, which is going to be quite dark in the background there. But I wanted to start doing some blocking, and now that the sky is drying, it's not quite so difficult to apply the colours. And then I do the same thing with shadows underneath the tractor. As soon as the layers start to dry, you can then apply these shadow areas. There's shadow on the farmer, underneath the tractor, and there's lots of shadow on the sheds behind, and then parts in the engine. But I like to get some of the shadow puddles underneath the wheels as well, because it was great light that day. I think it was late afternoon when I took the photo reference. Actually, if I remember correctly, it was a video that I made, and this was just a still image from that video. It can be a slow process, but it's so much better to ensure that you wait and then start to work on the next part. After that, it's just a case of really looking carefully at what it is you're trying to paint. Every mix that you do, make sure you water it down so much, and then anything which you don't water down like this, is a commitment to very, very dark shadow. Now really I shouldn't be using such a large brush for such a small area, but sometimes I make those mistakes and then I adjust here to a smaller brush. So I use the tissue to pull it back a bit. I use the smaller brush and you can see immediately it just looks so much better and much more accurate. I then use this is the brush which comes with the watercolour set. I use this brush to do the shadow on the steering wheel and on the farmer. And then I start to pick out certain parts from the engine. It's not a bad little brush. I must admit I could have used something slightly larger, but it doesn't hurt. It's a bullet tip brush, which is always quite nice to have a round tip to the brush instead of flat where you have to be very thoughtful before you start to use it. Some of these considerations as well, where the shadow goes, is something which is worth taking extra time and care to make sure that you're doing it correctly. After the first layer is dried, I start to apply darker layers of red on top, but it's nice to have that vary so that it's not all going to go darker at the same time. Some parts stay lighter, and that's the reason why you don't just go dark immediately, is that some parts stay dark, get darker, and some parts stay a bit lighter, and it makes it look more realistic. And the way that watercolour dries, it adds its own level of natural kind of texture to the finish. It's what's sort of magical about watercolour paint, is that it just looks, I don't know, it looks more interesting. It dries a lot more naturally than what acrylic or oil does, where you really have to work the options with the other paints. You have to be very careful about the different bits and pieces that you touch, but so long as you stay fairly light with your mixes, you can dab the brush around and try to cover different areas. Now I continuously darken the shed area behind, and then I try to touch up certain aspects of the vehicle itself, because it's a progression of everything shifts in tone together. So as the tractor goes darker, certain shadows will have to shift with it, and the lighter parts may have to go darker as well. Otherwise you may have made something slightly too light, which is not a problem for watercolour, but when something goes much darker, the range may be a little bit more inaccurate to the reference. But it's usually a combination of brushes which make these pieces look better. So I'm now using a flathead brush, but it's a very small brush, and trying to pick out certain bits and pieces here and there. I always really appreciate the colours and the strength of the pigment for watercolour, and I don't always use them to their full potential because I like a very soft pigment. I like to pull it back quite a bit and make sure that it stays not too dark or not too bright, I should say, not heavily saturated, but that's my preference, and if you can work it differently then you go for it. My preference is to make sure that it's nothing too dark. Now to get the shirt, it was a little bit tricky, but you can see because it's a flathead brush, all I did was slowly paint little square sections, and when they joined up I tried not to worry about that. I just tried to continuously make them little squares with gaps in between, and then when there was gaps left it just made it look more natural, like gaps in the shirt. And now I'm just progressively going through bits and pieces and trying to look closer and closer at the reference and seeing what I've missed. One thing that you definitely have to consider is getting in the background. And foliage can be tricky, but it's also got a lot of capabilities with watercolour to make different types of greens, and that is what will make things look more realistic, is so long as you don't have the same green covering whole areas. You want to try and vary up the greens, because bushes and hedges are usually different types of plants that are growing, and that's what you want to try and represent with the colours. Having a tissue on hand helps not only to try to remove mistakes, but if you apply something that's much darker than you expected, just dabbing it quickly will lighten it. It'll still leave an impression of what you've put on. Now, something with watercolour which you can do, that I don't do often but is always a possibility, is if you ever need to move something, so say you've painted some area which you really don't want to have painted, you can then flood it with water, not uncontrollably, but that specific area that's gone too far, and the pigment will move. And you can either lift it up with a tissue, or you can push it over with your brush, but you've got to do that fairly lightly, otherwise you will damage the paper. And now it's at this stage, I add in the sea in the background, and I want the sea to be really subtle. I didn't want it to be too dark, because then it just doesn't look like it's in the distance. The darker things are, the more they look like they're in the foreground. So things should become lighter as they recede into the background. Now, as I say this, what happens here is that I work on the foliage and it all starts to darken. And you'll see what the effect is that the background then becomes darker and more heavily saturated than the foreground, than the tractor itself. And the tractor doesn't become the focal point anymore, the hedges do. And that's the effect of darkening and strengthening the values of certain areas, which is why, as I said earlier, everything has to shift with each other. And I've tried to use different greens and share some of the colours across each other, so that some of the shadows can be some of the tones for the lighter sections of other hedges and bushes there. And then trying to add bits of browns and greys into the dirt on the floor, but I don't want it to cover too much of a space, so that I keep pulling it back a little bit to try and make it look gravelly. And then I continuously work the shadows in the background and try to keep pushing it into this darker and more heightened tonality. And that's what I'm doing with the sheds here. And then I start drawing in the windows and doors for the sheds. And I want to keep these fairly light, because they are going into the background, and then the darkest shed closer, which is darkest. And I think that has quite a nice effect to it. But as I said, all this time whilst I've been working on the background tone, the tractor has stayed light. So the tractor is now disappearing more and more the longer that I work on everything else around it. Which means that I'm due to start working on the tonality of the reds in the tractor, on the different tones around the wheels and the engine and his trousers and his skin. Everything needs to shift along with what's happened in the background. So I start to add different reds onto the tractor here, and I try to make sure that I'm applying shadows in the right places, and I'm trying to preserve some of those lighter tones. It's tricky to do, but it's always worth shifting these things much darker, because you want the focal point to be the centre and not the background. So I have to make sure that everything starts to pop in the foreground here. And look at your photo reference. Consider the form as well. So you can see on the bonnet of the tractor, which is just the top front part, I have a line of a light pinkish line going along the side, and that suggests an edge. And that's what you really want, is to show that there's a transition and a difference between the side and the top. And then all these little bits and surfaces here are just tiny little touches. That's why you can see the brush just zipping around back and forth, and the differences are very slight. You can see there I'm doing the tonality on the skin. That's just to show a transition of the shadow to light. I then start to add some more tone to the sky, because as much as the sky was quite white that day, there was a bit of blue here and there. So I think it really adds something to try and include a little suggestion of that. I darken the shadows on the farmer and on the steering wheel, so that now becomes a little bit more bold and more the focal point again, because the contrast between light and shadow is what your eyes will be drawn to look at. The engine has a lot more darks in it, so I make sure that I work on the engine and I try to make sure that these shapes start to pop out, and not pop out, sorry, but they start to include some of these darker sections so that they do look like these details that I was seeing in the reference. Then there are bits of shadows here and there, and I try to look as keenly as I can at the parts which are defining the transitional differences. So where the sunlight is coming will be hitting on these railings which go up to the roof, and then on the inside of those railings will be an edge of shadow. So that's what I've tried to include. But there we are. That is the painting as I left it, and it was quite interesting to go through this process. I quite liked the painting. I ended up signing it in the bottom right hand corner and then taking it to the farmer. Okay, so that is the day done. The farmer has the painting. He had a couple of critiques which was quite interesting. I think he noticed that the tyre wasn't on the wheel correctly. He said it looked as though it was falling apart. It's nice to see that as much as I may be using reference and trying my best, he's going to notice things which I don't see, and that's something I'm now going to try and be especially keen on the details in the future. Well, I'm glad that I gave it to him as a gift. He's been very generous, letting me on his land to take photographs and ask him questions, so it's the least I can do. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, then please leave a like, comment down below, subscribe to the channel, ring that notification bell. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.